there's the moral application of the initiation of violence, and then there's morality. And they're not exactly the same thing. And so if my neighbor, let's just say, my neighbor is not being a good husband and being a good father. Okay, so like let's say he's just very cold with his children and like doesn't pay the bills on time and doesn't work and is lazy and does all types of things that I judge to be morally wrong. Like I think he should be a better father and a better husband. But if I go over there and beat him over the head with a club to make him be a better husband and father, it's not as simple an equation as was he morally right or wrong? The question is it morally justified for me to enact this force against him in order to make, like, is that more moral or immoral than his initial sin? So that's the question that you get into when you start talking about government regulating a lot of these things. It's not as simple as you're making it out that, well, if people own themselves, then it has to be morally justified, whatever they do.
Okay, so let's see if we can't parse this out. And again, I'll see if I can't just steelman this with my criticism. So the thing is that I agree. We can look at scales, right? We can say that we can get to absurd conclusions if we were to say that there's no time or place to apply some sort of like aggression towards somebody, right? Otherwise, you would aggress on them for anything that you consider some kind of moral failure. And obviously, that's not what either of us are after. Sure. What I'm saying is that if we take it to its logical conclusion, libertarianism, which is what I said in my opening, as a consequence of itself, has to actually lead to degeneracy. And the reason is because of the idea here is that I own me and you own you. And if we consent to the two things we do together and it hurts nobody else, therefore not violating the non-aggression principle, which is the foundation for which this thing, revolves, then how can you make ever a claim against homosexuals getting married or against incest or against any of these things? How can you possibly make that claim? That's the ultimate question.
Okay, so a couple things here. I don't think that's the ultimate question, and I do think that I could make the claim against that in the same way that you could. And I think we already established this, right? That we can both make the claim for the exact same reasons because we believe in God and we believe in morality and we believe that this is immoral. So we both have the exact same ability to make the claim. But if we're talking about what your more, I think, broader point that you made there, that libertarianism leads to immorality, I think is completely wrong. And I think this is like kind of the most important fundamental miscalculation that a lot of people on the right who reject libertarianism make. The idea that, well, freedom and liberty is really what leads to degeneracy. And that's just not true. And in fact, empirically and logically, we can look at the situation, particularly the situation of the United States of America, and go, look, as the government has grown bigger and bigger, you've seen degeneracy get more and more out of control. And I understand why there is a movement against degeneracy. I understand we live in a moment right now where I think our society is essentially disintegrating. And I think that that's one of the things that, Andrew, you kind of are, I don't know, prominent for pointing out. The disintegration of values and norms all throughout.
But the reason I believe that those values and norms are being eroded is because of libertarians and social leftist elites who often will move towards this principle of non-aggression. They just do it in two different ways. The way one, which libertarian does it, is by saying, if I'm not violating you and your non-aggression principle in some way, then you really have no claim to tell me to do anything, and everything is affirmed through private property. The leftist just affirms it the opposite direction, says there's no such thing as private property, but they apply the same principle of, if I'm not hurting anybody, then what's the problem? And so as we dive into what is the non-aggression principle, the non-aggression principle is the principle that if you are not aggressing against somebody else and you own yourself, they cannot aggress against you. So via consent, you cannot utilize the state, Dave, to have them go and break up an incest family who is all consenting with each other nightly. You can't do it.
I understand that's your perspective on this, but that has nothing to do with what I'm getting into. So actually what the non-aggression principle implies is that at best, government ought to be severely restricted, and at worst, the government ought to not exist at all. Now, as we've had the rise in government, and I mean, look, in the United States of America, just in the last 20 years, in the last 20 plus years, which we could go back a lot further than that, you've had a tremendous growth in the size of government. And what happens as the government gets bigger and bigger is that all of the things that Christians and traditionalists tend to value get undermined. And so this institution of the government that is inherently based on violating the non-aggression principle does its absolute best to replace, take over, and monopolize all of the areas where traditionally family and community had domain. And
yeah,
so
but why would that be problematic if the non-aggression principle logically should be ignored for these moral oughts? That's that is the question.
Well, hold on. That's a separate question. The point I'm making is that it's not an outgrowth of the non-aggression principle. It's an outgrowth of a rejection of the non-aggression principle. That's actually what leads to all of this.
So then if we were to have the non-aggression principle with a shrunken government, are we still going to use the government in order to aggress against consenting adults who want to have incest? Or not?
As long as a government exists, it will be used to aggress against non-consenting adults. And
great.
So, yes,
then
as I don't know.
Yes.
Listen, Andrew, you're trying to obsess over this incest argument. Okay, laws against incest. I'll grant you that. Sure, fine. Can we move on to any other topic now?
Yeah, but
can we move on to talking about the state of the country as it actually exists?
Yeah, but this is the state of the country as it actually exists.
Well, hold on. It's pretty funny because we live under the most powerful centralized government in the history of the world. The biggest organization in the history of the world is the United States of America's federal government in Washington, D.C., spending over $6 trillion a year, employing millions of people with the capability of overthrowing regimes all around the world. And instead, the argument we're getting here is, but if there was no government, who would stop an adult brother and sister from that's kind of goofy, man. It doesn't really have anything to do with.
I just want to let you know that saying it's kind of goofy isn't an argument. You just said if we scale the government down to its umpteenth point of scale down, as long as there was still a government, you would want them to enforce action via violating the non-aggression principle for your preference. So if there was,
no, that's not what I said.
Well, it's it's an entailment. If the government's really, really, really big and enforce it right now, and then you say, but if it was really, really small, we would still enforce that because you want to have those laws, then regardless of the size of government, the degeneracy is still going to exist, right? And it's still going to need to be enforced against regardless of the size of the government.
Wait, I'm sorry, can you rephrase the question? What is it exactly you're asking me?
I'm asking you, if we reach anarcho-utopia, we scale the government down.
I'm not for a utopia, but
okay.
So
but
whatever.
if we reach anarcho, whatever you want, as the ultimate, right? The government is now scaled down to the point where it's essentially gone, right? Would you still want enforcement against this kind of thing? And how could you have enforcement against it without a government?
What against what kind of thing?
Like incest or gay marriage or any of these degenerate actions.
Okay. Well, I think there's a pretty big gap between incest and gay marriage, but I will say that I think there's a gap between that.
What is it?
But I think they're two different things.
Yeah, they're two different things, but they're the same as far as two consenting adults doing what they want, right?
Yeah, me and you doing this debate are also two consenting adults doing what they want, but there's a gap between those things. So anyway,
what does that have to do? I mean, it logically tracks that if dude, you can't go on these long rambling diatribes, and I do 4 seconds. I do 4 seconds, and you go berserk. Just calm down. Let me ask the actual question,
dude. Come on, man. I asked you to clarify your question,
and I'm trying to clarify it so that you understand it.
But don't act like I'm going on these long rants and you're not talking. I mean,
well,
come
you
on,
filibuster. You don't say that much, but I'm still willing to engage.
Oh, come on, Andrew.
I'm super concise. So I'm super concise.
Okay.
I'm going to get right to it, right, so that you understand what I'm saying to you.
Okay.
What I'm asking you is that the enforcement mechanism against this degeneracy, which you consider to be morally wrong, absent a state, are you still going to want an enforcement mechanism against these moral wrongs? You say, no, there's a big difference between incest and homosexual marriage or homosexual sex. However, the truth is that both of these things are exactly logically similar when it comes to two consenting adults doing what it is that they want when they want to do it without hurting anybody else. How's that not the case?
Well, again, as I just pointed out, we're also two consenting adults doing what we want without hurting anyone else. But I think that's very different. So I'm just saying that I'm not even saying I support either of those things. I'm saying I see them as different. No, the truth is that if we didn't have what we have today, and this is what happens with every very powerful centralized government, is that their biggest enemy becomes the family, the church, the community, because they don't like things that compete with them. If we actually got rid of all of the impediments between that, you would see an enormous return to normalcy in this country. You would see, I mean, look, starting even in the 1930s with Social Security, when you had the government take over the role of we'll take care of old people when they get older. What you used to have was what? That parents would rely on their children to take care of them when they get older. Once you remove all of the disincentives toward normalcy and family and community, if the state was to be reduced to the size that you're talking about, no, my concern would not be, do we have federal agents with guns going in to break up incest amongst adults anytime it's happening? I don't even know how you would go about enforcing that.
What about people who just want to transition?
Again, the transitioning stuff is totally a statist product. This is something that's come out of the universities that are essentially government programs that has been perpetuated by the corporate media and
I'm not disputing any of that. Should they be allowed to do it though?
No. Well, that's
no.
Listen,
no.
Well, okay. Hold on. Let me say this to be clear. Children, absolutely not. You should not be allowed to do that.
Adults,
a doctor should lose their license if they were ever to perform a surgery or something.
But it's voluntary.
Sure.
And they consented.
But a license could also be voluntary, and a medical board could also be voluntary. So what does that mean?
Well, so that's interesting that you bring that up, considering that the AMA was just a large corporate entity that was not government regulated. Did it
get government money?
Started off as a trade organization, in fact, and what it did was it defamed all other types of medicine, and that was not the government doing that. That was a private institution which was doing that for the purpose Carnegie. Another private institution, Carnegie. The thing is that private institutions are just as susceptible to this type of overreach as the government is. Well, now, hang on, let me finish. My turn.
Sure. Go ahead.
So as we dive into this, though, these medical licenses, why would you even need to have a medical license in an anarcho-capitalist system? You wouldn't even need to have one. And the voluntarism then of this man who wants to go in and have this elective surgery done, why would that be a problem? There's no medical licenses, Dave. It's anarcho-capitalism, baby.